Well, I suppose by now most of you have heard the original story of Ratman, and for those of you who haven't, I'll just summarize it briefly, but the story that I wanted to tell you today is about some stuff, some recently emerged information about things that happened to Ratman later in his life. Some things have just come to light about this other older story, which I found quite interesting. See, when I first moved down to Texas about 10 years ago, I heard a story being told that had eerie similarities to the story about Ratman that we used to tell in Wyoming, but with some subtle variations. And so the story in Texas refers to a character who's known as La Llorona, the hollering woman. And if you've ever driven Interstate 10 across Texas between San Antonio and Houston, there's even a sign on the exit for La Llorona Creek, I believe it's called, which means Hollering Woman Creek. Her story, which I said was very similar in some ways to Ratman's story, also involves a young girl who was swept away in a flood, in a spring flood that came into the house unexpectedly during the night, and tragically swept away the younger sister, Ratman's younger sister, that is. And in the case of La Llorona, there's not a brother in the story necessarily, but the story with her was that after her daughter was swept away, that she began to go crazy. She was going down to the creek every night and hollering and yelling and howling for her daughter and grieving and yelling. Anyway, that's how she got the name La Llorona, which means hollering woman. Now, this story has some basis in fact, and it's not actually that long ago that this event supposedly occurred. But a part of that story that's seldom told is that La Llorona became famous not only for her insanity, but also for her great beauty, which attracted men to her as a prize. And in those days, there were some tall men with tall boots striding around this part of Texas, including such notables as Davy Crockett and Jim Bowie, who the Bowie knife is named after. And a lot of these men tried their hand at La Llorona as suitors because she was famously beautiful. She was like a known woman living in this part of the country where there was not a lot of that. And then sometimes I guess men are attracted to that crazy edge on a woman. I can't explain what happened with that, but you know, it's not Jim Bowie or Davy Crockett who then was a successful suitor, but rather it was Johnny Appleseed. And not a lot of people know this. Like Johnny Appleseed, mainly what we hear about is in his younger days when he was roaming around the Pacific Northwest and sowing all these apple trees. However, he undertook an amazing journey when he was about to retire, because he had heard about the just newly opening up land in Texas, in the Texas Panhandle, and part of stuff that used to be Mexico, which he thought would be perfect for a new crop that he was going to try here. So actually, Johnny Appleseed walked from Washington down to Texas, as the story goes, and when he found out about the existence of La Llorona, of the hollering woman, he did make a pass at her, and they fell in love. And so for some years, Johnny Appleseed lived right there in La Llorona Creek, as it's now called, and I don't think that he died there, but he did live there for a while, and they conceived a child together. Anyway, that story ties into the other story because of something that happened not that long ago along the Gulf Coast. There's a couple events in the news that intersected, and I don't think most people in the country realize that these things happened at the same time, and it caused conditions in this part of the country to revert to a very primitive state for a time. Because what happened was this. There came a summer where the prices, the energy prices, spiked. There was price manipulation in California, and there was a shortage of coal because of some kind of problems with the trains, I think having to do with the railroads, not shipping as much coal as they had promised. So the prices spiked on electricity, and parts of the country were undergoing rolling blackouts to cover up for the fact that the system was inadequate and that it was being rigged. And at the same time, there was a storm that hit part of Texas, and it's not as well known as like Hurricane Katrina, just because it hit a part of the country that's less populated. But in some ways, that made it even more devastating. And what happened was that a storm came through. It was in the summer, in the heat of the summer, and there was a family that lived out on on the verge, of a small town that's off of the interstate, that's off the beaten path, on the south side of the interstate. And as the story goes, there were two kids in this family, and their parents had told them that they were not to go down and play in the drainage area. There's like a creek that flowed into a bayou, and there was a big culvert pipe there. And they said, why? And their parents said, it's because Ratman lives over there. Now, these kids had not heard the story of Ratman, which was set in Wyoming, but they laughed, and they thought that their parents were making a play off of Batman, of course, but came to find out there was some truth to the story after all, because then a hurricane hit in the middle of summer, and the area was under rolling blackouts. So if you lose electricity in Texas in the summer, you lose two very important things, or three, depending on how long it lasts. First of all, you lose the lights, so you can't see around you at night. Second, you lose the ability to cool yourself off, which is a pretty serious emergency in some situations, just as serious as freezing to death. You can overheat in this part of the country. But then the third thing that you start to lose is access to drinking water. And so that's what was happening, because the power was out already when the storm hit. And so then the storm water brought in a storm surge that inundated some of the power plants in the area that were connected to the national grid normally, but all those switches were off because of the rolling brownouts. So when the hurricane passed, the power was out for 1 day, then it was out for 2 days, now it was out for 3 days, and all of the ice in everyone's refrigerator had completely melted. And at this point, when people could get back into the power stations and the substations, they couldn't turn it back on because it had all been filled up with seawater, and so it was going to take a lot of time to get everything back online. Meanwhile, the cities, the communities began to lose. They didn't have any more gas for their generators to pump water into the town water supply. It's just a simple matter of budgetary considerations, right? You can't store so much diesel because you have to change it out every year or so. You can't just you can't keep that much on hand. And so when the roads washed out, well, of course, the government came in, and FEMA, and they did restore access to the main highway. But this is a little town that's, south, an hour off the main highway. So it just so happens that these two kids were starting to get thirsty and desperate for water. And so they were talking about what to do, the two kids were, while their parents were taking a nap. And in the heat of the afternoon, they decided to go down by the culvert, by the bayou, where they had heard that, they weren't supposed to go, because from the edge of their backyard, they could hear the trickling sound of water. And I guess it was just an attractant to them, because they knew they had to get water, and they followed that sound. And they went down there, and what they saw was floating in the floodwaters, there was a rounded sort of shape that looked gray, and it was about this tall, and it was about this big around, and it looked scaly like the back of an armadillo all the way around. And as they approached it, because it was bobbing in the water, they could hear a sound coming from inside, a sound of a person playing the guitar. And so they went over there, and it was tied or anchored in such a way that a culvert pipe was draining out into a bayou there, and it was floating gently and bobbing in the water of the bayou as the flood water slowly receded from the hurricane. So this is brackish and or polluted water that it was floating in. But what they found out was that there was a person inside, and that person claimed to be the son of La Llorona and Johnny Appleseed's daughter, who ended up married to Ratman. And so this guy, the son of Ratman, was in this thing floating and bobbing in the water, and these kids met him, and they talked to him. They called out to him when he stopped playing guitar for a second, and they yelled, "Is there someone in there?" They started communicating with him, and ultimately he came out and he told them his story. This thing that he was on, his raft, was made of sticks and mud, and he would bake the mud over a campfire in sections, and I don't think it weighed probably 500 pounds. It was just a small nest that one person could be in, but the top of it was made of cast-off water bottles, and he had cut the water bottles, I guess, and like butterfly folded them so that it would cause condensation on the inside, and then water would drip down that was drinkable. So even though he was floating his nest, his raft, over polluted saltwater, brackish water in the bayou there, it didn't matter, because the water that he was drinking was coming from the water vapor that is purified through distillation, right? So anyway, that was the story, and that is how these kids found out about what happened to Ratman. And I don't know the story of how he ended up with La Llorona's beautiful daughter, but that's probably a tale for another day. Interesting as it may be, it uncovers a little bit more of the story of Ratman, and what his family's doing now, I'm not sure. But I hope you enjoyed the story, and have a pleasant afternoon.